My son kicked me out of the penthouse I bought on his 35th birthday because he thought I was a burden on his budget. He had no idea that his apartment, his company, and his car all belonged to me. 3 days later, sitting in a cheap motel, I watched my screen light up with 97 missed calls from the boy who told me to leave. I simply turned the phone over. My name is Lorraine Hart, 61 years old, and tonight I felt less like a mother and more like a ghost haunting the edges of a life I had paid for. I stood in the shadow of the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse in downtown Dallas, watching the city lights reflect against the glass like spilled gold, while smooth R&B music thumped through the room. It was my son Eric's 35th birthday. Champagne flowed endlessly, and I smoothed the front of my old navy dress, a simple thing I had worn for years, before gripping the silver tray to clear empty glasses from the tables. To the 30 guests laughing and drinking around me, I was just the help, silently weaving through the crowd to ensure their coasters were never wet. Lorraine, you are blocking the lighting. I stepped back quickly as Brittany, Eric's wife, waved me away with a manicured hand. She was wearing a shimmering, body-hugging dress that caught every flicker of light. Her phone held high as she live-streamed to her followers. "Hey guys, just showing you the view from our party. Lifestyle Dallas is lit tonight." She turned to the camera, flashing a practiced smile, completely ignoring me. She never called me Mom. It was always just Lorraine. I moved toward the main table where Eric was holding court with his friends. He looked handsome in his tailored suit, his face flushed with expensive wine and the pride of being the center of attention. He was talking loudly about his job as the Chief Technology Officer at Skyline Mobility, a startup he claimed to carry on his back. "Honestly, inflation is killing everything right now," Eric said, swirling his drink. "You guys have no idea what the lease on a penthouse like this runs these days. $12,000 a month. It is insane. I am practically carrying the whole family on my shoulders." One of his friends nodded sympathetically. "It is the price of success." "Bro." Eric laughed, but the sound had a sharp edge to it. He gestured vaguely in my direction without looking at me. "Yeah. Well, it is not just the rent. Feeding an extra adult in the house is not exactly cheap either. Mom here is not exactly contributing to the grocery bill. You know?" The table erupted in laughter. A few guests glanced at me with awkward pity, but most just chuckled along. I froze, the tray in my hands feeling heavier than lead. Brittany chimed in, her voice rising so the whole room could hear. "Exactly, in this economy, everyone has to share the cost. Even my parents chip in when they visit. It is just basic fairness." Eric set his glass down hard on the table. The room went quiet, sensing the shift in the air. He looked at me, his eyes cold and devoid of the warmth I used to see when he was a boy. "Look, Mom," Eric said, his tone flat. "We need to be realistic. If you want to keep living here, starting next month, you need to pay your share of the rent. Or, well, it might be better if you found a place that fits your budget. It is just about mutual respect." The silence that followed was suffocating. Not a single person spoke up for me. They just watched, waiting to see if the old woman would cry. I set the tray down on the nearest surface. My hands trembled, but I clasped them together to steady them. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw a stranger. "I understand," I said softly. "Thank you all for coming. This will likely be the last birthday I celebrate with you in this apartment." Eric nodded, looking relieved that I had not made a scene. I turned and walked to the small guest room at the back of the hallway. I did not cry. I opened my closet and took out a single suitcase. I packed 3 sets of clothes. Then I took my old smartphone from my purse. I scrolled past Eric's name and stopped at a contact I had not called in years. Reyes, estate attorney. I pressed the call button as the heavy front door of the penthouse clicked shut behind me, leaving the party. And my son, on the other side. The smell of diesel fumes always takes me back to Oklahoma. I was 22 years old, working the graveyard shift at a dusty gas station off the interstate, when I first met Joe. He was a long-haul trucker with grease under his fingernails and a smile that made the fluorescent lights overhead seem a little less harsh. He ordered black coffee and a pack of gum, and I remember thinking his hands looked like they could wrestle a steer. But when he placed the coins on the counter, he was as gentle as a priest handling a rosary. We got married 6 months later in my mother's backyard. There was no white limousine, just strings of yellow lights hung between the oak trees and a keg of cheap beer on ice, instead of a diamond ring. Joe held my hands, his calloused thumbs brushing my knuckles, and made a promise that weighed more than gold. Lorraine. I can't give you a big rock right now, he had whispered, his voice thick with emotion. But one day, we are going to have a truck with our name on the door. I promise you that. For the first few years, that promise lived in a rusted tin box under our bed. I worked part-time doing bookkeeping for a local bakery, and Joe drove 14 hours a day for a company that treated him like a machine. Every Friday, we knelt by the bed and put every spare dollar into that box. We ate beans on toast and wore our clothes until the threads gave out, eyes fixed on the dream. The day we bought the truck, I thought my heart would burst. It was a used Peterbilt, painted a mossy green that had seen better days. But to us, it was beautiful. We slapped a cheap vinyl decal on the door that read, Heartline Logistics. People in town laughed. They said a husband and wife operation would not last through the winter. They were wrong. I learned to run the business from the kitchen table. While Joe was out on the road, battling snowstorms and sleepless nights, I was on the phone, fighting for contracts with factories and farms. I taught myself corporate accounting with a crying baby Eric on my hip. I calculated fuel costs down to the penny and routed deliveries to save every possible mile. Eric grew up in that rental house outside Tulsa, doing his homework on a table sticky with engine oil residue while I negotiated freight rates. By the time I turned 40, Heartline Logistics was no longer a joke. We had a fleet of 30 trucks and a real office in Dallas. That was when our lawyer sat us down and structured the Heartline Holdings Trust. It was designed to protect our assets, placing everything the company, the properties, the investments under a legal umbrella where I was the primary beneficiary with absolute control. Then Joe died. A tire blowout on a rainy highway took him from me in an instant. I buried my husband, but I did not bury his dream. I became harder. I turned Heartline into a beast of the southern highways. But at home, I made a choice. I saw how money ruined the children of my competitors, turning them soft and entitled. So, I played the part of the struggling widow. When Eric got his acceptance letter to the engineering program at the University of Texas in Austin, he came running to me, waving the paper. "Mum, I got in. But the tuition, it is so expensive." I smiled, hiding the pain of missing Joe, and lied to my son's face. "Don't you worry, baby," I told him, smoothing his hair. You got a scholarship? And the rest? Well, We will take out loans. We will manage. He never knew that I wrote a check for the full tuition the next morning from the trust. He never knew the sleek laptop I gave him was not a refurbished deal I found, but the top-of-the-line model bought with company dividends. I wanted him to build his own character, to respect the dollar the way Joe and I had. I wanted him to be a man made of grit, not a boy made of gold. I just never imagined that the character he would build would be one that looked down on the very hands that fed him. I left the penthouse before the party even ended. I did not wait for the cake or the final toasts. I simply called an Uber and watched the glittering Dallas skyline retreat in the rear window until it was nothing but a smear of light against the black Texas sky. The driver dropped me off at a motel near the interstate, the kind of place where the neon sign buzzed with a dying flicker and the air smelled of lemon disinfectant, masking the scent of stale cigarettes and damp carpet. It was a sharp, brutal contrast to the heated marble floors of my son's apartment. But strangely, it felt more like home than that glass tower ever had. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress and unbuckled my shoes. My feet ached under the harsh yellow light of the bedside lamp. I looked down at my hands. They were spotted with age now, but the calluses were still there, layered deep beneath the skin. These were the hands that had signed hundreds of freight contracts. These were the hands that had rested on Joe's shoulders the night we decided to bet our lives on a single truck. I picked up my phone and dialed. It rang 3 times before a groggy voice answered. Lorraine. It is past midnight. Is everything all right? It was Monica Reyes, my estate attorney in San Antonio. She had been with me since the trust was formed, the only person left who knew exactly where the bodies were buried, metaphorically speaking. I need you to open the file on the Heartline Holdings Trust, I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my chest. I heard the rustle of bedsheets and the click of a lamp on the other end. I don't need to open it. Lorraine. I wrote it. You are the sole beneficiary. You have absolute power over every asset inside it. Why, what happened? Tell me about Skyline Mobility? I said. Monica sighed. You know the details. When Eric started that company, he needed seed money. No bank would touch him without collateral. You authorized the investment through the trust as an anonymous angel investor. In exchange, Heartline Holdings owns 62% of the common stock. We kept your name off the papers just like you asked, so he could feel like he did it himself. And the penthouse owned by Heartline Holdings LLC. Monica recited from memory, leased to Eric for 1/3 of the market value. It is practically a gift. The Range Rover Company fleet vehicle, loaned to him for brand representation. The contract has a recall clause that can be triggered at any time. I closed my eyes. Hearing it listed out loud made the betrayal taste like ash in my mouth. My son played the big man, the self-made millionaire, while he was standing on a foundation I had poured for him, concrete and steel, paid for with my sweat. He told me tonight that I need to pay rent. I whispered into the phone. He said I was a burden on his budget. He talked about mutual respect. Oh, Lorraine. Monica's voice softened, losing its professional edge. What do you want to do? Do you want to forgive him like you always do? Or do you want to use what you built to teach them a lesson they will never forget for a moment? I hesitated. I thought of Eric as a little boy, asleep in the cab of the truck. But then, a notification pinged on my phone. Monica had sent me a link. You need to see this before you decide, she said. I clicked it. It was a screen recording of Brittany's live stream from 20 minutes ago. She was holding a glass of champagne, giggling into the camera. Seriously. You guys, Brittany said on the screen, rolling her eyes. Some old people just refuse to work. They think they can just live off their kids forever. It is so toxic. We finally had to set some boundaries tonight. The heat rose in my neck, hot and suffocating. The sadness evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. I remembered Joe's face when he worked double shifts so Eric could have braces. I remembered the years I wore the same coat so Eric could have new sneakers. Lorraine Monica asked tentatively, "Should I draft a plan for a gradual divestment?" I looked at the peeling wallpaper of the motel room. "No," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "Not gradual. It happens now. I want the entire power structure flipped in 72 hours. Everything. Everything." I confirmed. Evict them. Repossess the car. Freeze the credit cards. And call a shareholder meeting for Skyline. I am done being the silent partner. I hung up the phone and lay back on the cheap bedspread. I had no property in my name. Not even the clothes on my back, really, because it all belonged to the trust. But as I lay there in the dark, listening to the distant roar of 18-wheelers tearing down the highway outside, I felt a surge of power I had not felt in years. The engines sounded like the past coming back to reclaim what was owed. For the first time in a long time, I was driving. The next morning, I walked into the glass-walled conference room of Reyes and Associates in San Antonio. I had left the navy dress in the motel trash can. I was wearing a charcoal grey suit I had kept in storage for 5 years. It smelled slightly of cedar, but it fit perfectly. I did not walk like a retired widow or a grandmother looking for a handout. I walked like the woman who had built a logistics empire from a single truck. Monica was waiting for me. She spread the files out across the mahogany table like a general laying out a battle map. The paperwork represented the entirety of my life's work, the Heartline Holdings trust documents, the penthouse lease agreement, the vehicle loan terms, and the angel investment contract for Skyline Mobility. "Everything is ready for your signature," Monica said, her voice low and professional. I picked up the pen. It felt heavy and cold, like steel. I started with the apartment. "Terminate the lease," I said, my voice showing no emotion. "Send the notice to Skyline Mobility since they are the payer of record. Give them 30 days to vacate. If Eric wants to sign a new lease, he can do so at the current market rate. $12,000 a month. No family discount. Treat him like any other tenant." I signed the paper with a sharp scratch of ink. Next was the Range Rover. I looked at the clause regarding brand representation. "Pull it." I ordered. "Cite failure to meet brand standards." I saw Brittany posing on the hood in a bikini to sell diet tea on her social media. That is not how Heartline assets are treated. Send the tow truck. Monica nodded and made a note. She picked up the phone to call the bank. I listened as she instructed them to remove Eric and Brittany as authorized users on the corporate American Express immediately. And Monica. I interrupted. "I want a full audit of the last 12 months of spending. I want to see every latte, every flight, every handbag. Freeze the secondary limits." Finally, we came to the Skyline Mobility contract. This was the one that would hurt the most. It gave Heartline Holdings me the power to call an emergency shareholder meeting if there was a risk of mismanagement. "Activate Article 4, I said, signing the bottom line. "Call the meeting. 48 hours from now. Agenda review of executive management and fiscal responsibility. With the legal ink drying, I dialed Denise Coleman, my COO. She had been with me for 15 years, running the day-to-day operations of Heartline Logistics while I stayed in the shadows. Denise. I am temporarily moving back to the cabin near the truck yard in Fort Worth. I said, I need the keys left under the mat. I am going dark for a few days. There was a pause on the line as I explained the situation. Denise let out a sharp breath. Lorraine. Are you sure? Denise asked, her voice tight with concern. This is going to hit his ego like a freight train. You could take the whole company down with him. Is it worth destroying what he built? He didn't build it. Denise. I did. I replied, staring at my signature on the termination papers. If he doesn't learn this lesson now, the people he drags down later won't just be me. It will be his employees. It will be his investors. I have to stop the bleeding. Monica hit send on the emails. Digital notifications flew out into the ether: eviction notices, credit freeze alerts, repo orders. It was a silent, invisible bombardment. I walked out to the parking lot and climbed into the cab of an old Heartline pickup truck. As I turned the key and the engine roared to life, I felt a strange calm settling over me. I was not a mother running away anymore. I was a driver starting a long haul, and for the first time in years, the only cargo I was carrying was my own pride. 3 days after the party, I woke up with a headache that felt like a drill boring into my temples. The heavy blackout curtains were drawn open, letting the merciless Texas sun flood the master bedroom. I groaned and rolled over, shielding my eyes. Good morning. Guys, welcome back to the daily grind. Brittany's voice chirped from the corner of the room. She was already dressed in her yoga gear, phone held high on a tripod, filming her morning routine. She swept her arm toward the panoramic window, showcasing the Dallas skyline. Just a reminder that this view didn't come free, she told her followers, flashing a perfect, veneered smile. This is what happens when two young people commit to the hustle. We built this life brick by brick. I sat up, rubbing my face, trying to shake off the lingering taste of expensive bourbon, before I could even reach for a glass of water. A sharp, authoritative knock echoed from the front door. I threw on a silk robe and stumbled into the living room. The building manager, a stiff man named Mr. Henderson, was standing there with a large envelope. Mr. Hart, he said, not making eye contact. This was couriered over this morning. It is urgent. I tore open the seal. It was a legal notice from a company called Heartline Holdings, LLC. My eyes scanned the legalese, and my stomach dropped. Notice of lease termination. We had 30 days to vacate, or we could sign a new lease at the adjusted market rate, which was nearly double what I was currently paying. What the hell is Heartline Holdings? I muttered. I had always assumed our landlord was some faceless investment fund. I had never questioned why a penthouse in this zip code cost us peanuts compared to the market. I just thought I was a good negotiator. I tossed the letter on the counter, assuming it was a clerical error I could fix later, and got dressed for brunch. Brittany wanted to go to the Monarch for content. An hour later, surrounded by my friends, I dropped my black titanium credit card onto the bill tray with a casual flick of my wrist. The waiter returned 2 minutes later, looking uncomfortable. I am sorry, Mr. Hart, he whispered, leaning in so the table wouldn't hear. The card was declined. Try it again, I snapped, loud enough that heads turned. It is an unlimited corporate account. We did? Sir? 3 times. The issuer has put a hold on the account. Brittany's smile faltered. She was in the middle of a live stream. Eric, just use another one. You are making it awkward. I pulled out my personal card. Declined. My backup card. Declined. I felt sweat prickling on my back. I had to Venmo a friend to cover the bill while making a joke about banking glitches. But the laughter at the table was thin. My phone started vibrating. It was the CFO of Skyline Mobility. Eric, we have a problem. His voice was shaking. Our operating accounts are frozen. The primary investor has triggered a forensic audit. They are demanding a review of every expense for the last 12 months. And those freight contracts, the ones your mum, the ones we secured through the old network, they just pulled the plug. Revenue is at zero. I drove to the office in a daze. When I walked into the co-working space in Uptown, the air was thick with tension. My staff looked at me with a mix of curiosity and fear. Sitting in the glass conference room were two suits I didn't recognize, and a woman I did Monica Reyes, my mother's old lawyer. Mr. Hart, Monica said, standing up. We are serving you notice of an emergency shareholder meeting tomorrow afternoon. The agenda is a vote of no confidence in the current CEO. You can't do that, I stammered. I founded this company. Actually, Heartline Holdings owns 62% of the common stock, she replied coolly. You work for them. I stormed out, needing to clear my head. I jumped into the Range Rover and gunned it onto the highway, 2 miles down the road. Red and blue lights flashed in my rearview mirror. I pulled over, expecting a speeding ticket. The officer walked up, hand on his holster. Step out of the vehicle. Sir, he ordered. What? Why this vehicle has been reported for immediate repossession by the owner. The authorization for use has been revoked. You have 24 hours to surrender it to the depot, or we tow it now. By the time I got back to the penthouse, my world had effectively disintegrated. Brittany was waiting for me, and she was furious. She had found the eviction letter. This is your mother, isn't it? She screamed, throwing the papers at me. Heartline Holdings. Heartline. My God. Eric, are you stupid? She owns everything. You said you handled the business. I didn't know. I yelled back. I thought she was just a retired accountant. Fix this. Brittany shrieked, her influencer mask completely gone, revealing pure panic. Call her right now and tell her to stop this childish game. I am not going to be homeless because you pissed off your mommy. I pulled out my phone. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hit the contact. Calling Mom. It rang, and rang, and rang. I called again. Voicemail. I called again. By the time the sun went down, the apartment was dark. Brittany had locked herself in the bedroom. I stood on the balcony, looking out at the city I thought I owned, gripping the railing until my knuckles turned white. My phone screen glowed in the darkness, mocking me with the tally of my desperation. 97 calls. Somewhere out there, in the dark expanse of Texas. She was watching. And for the first time in my life, I realized that the woman who had quietly cleared my plates for 35 years was the only reason I had a table to sit at. And she wasn't answering. I spent the morning chasing a ghost, desperate to find her. I drove to the rundown apartment complex on the south side, where Mum had told me she was living for the past 2 years. I pounded on Unit 4B until my knuckles were raw. Finally, a building manager with a grease-stained shirt opened the door of the main office, looking annoyed. She is gone? Buddy, he said, leaning against the doorframe. Mrs. Hart moved out 6 months ago. Said she was moving closer to work. Another family lives there now. 6 months, I stood in the hallway, stunned. She had been living somewhere else for half a year, and I had never even bothered to ask for her new address. I realized with a sick feeling in my stomach that I did not know where my own mother slept at night. Terrified, I called the only other family I had left her sister, my Aunt Martha. We hadn't spoken much since Dad died, mostly because Martha always looked at me like she knew something I didn't. When she answered, her voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "You finally called," she said. You stupid, selfish boy. Aunt Martha, please." I begged, gripping the steering wheel. "I need to see you. I don't know what is happening." She agreed to meet me at a diner in the suburbs, a place with checkered floors and the smell of burnt coffee. When I slid into the booth opposite her, she didn't say hello. She just reached into her oversized tote bag and slammed a rusted tin box onto the sticky table. "Open it," she commanded. I pried off the lid. It smelled of old paper and metal. Inside were photos of my father, young and impossibly strong, standing next to a very young mom in front of a beat-up green truck. There were newspaper clippings, handwritten ledgers, and a contract signed with a supermarket chain dated back to 1995. "You think your mother was just a bookkeeper?" Martha asked, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "You think she just counted pennies?" She pulled out a photo of Mom asleep at a desk, surrounded by mountains of paperwork, a half-eaten sandwich near her hand. "Your father was the heart of that company, Eric. But Lorraine, she was the brains and the spine. When the fuel crisis hit in the early 2000s, we all thought they would go under. Your dad was ready to sell the trucks. It was your mother who stayed up for 3 nights straight, renegotiating debt with the banks. She saved the business. She saved our family." I stared at the photo. I remembered that year. I was in middle school, angry that Mum had missed my soccer championship. I had told her she didn't care about me. I didn't know she was fighting a war to keep a roof over my head. Martha reached into the box and pulled out a photocopy of a business journal article I had never seen. The headline read, "Lorraine Hart, the woman behind the Southern Transport Empire. She kept her name out of the spotlight after your dad died," Martha said, pointing a finger at my chest. "She wanted you to grow up normal. She wanted you to respect the work, not just the money. She lived in that small apartment, drove that old truck, and wore those cheap clothes so you wouldn't turn into, well, into this." She gestured vaguely at my designer watch and my panicked face. "She tramped down her own shine so you could find yours," Martha whispered, her eyes wet. "And what did you do? You used her sacrifice as a prop for your wife's Instagram background." "I didn't know." I choked out. "I swear. I didn't know." "Because you never looked," Martha said, standing up and throwing a $10 bill on the table for her coffee. "You never looked past the checkbook." I left the diner feeling like my insides had been scooped out. I got into my car, but I didn't go home. I punched a name into Google Maps, Heartline Logistics. The GPS led me to a massive industrial park on the edge of Fort Worth. I had expected a small garage, maybe a few trucks. What I found was a sprawling depot. Rows of 18-wheelers were lined up like soldiers, their engines idling with a low, powerful rumble. Forklifts were moving pallets. It was a hive of activity, massive and loud and real. I drove up to the main office, a modest 2-story brick building. I got out of the car and looked up at the sign above the entrance. It was freshly painted, bold and blue. Heartline Logistics, a Heartline Holdings company. And there, in smaller script underneath, was the signature I had seen on permission slips and birthday cards my entire life. The signature I had dismissed as insignificant. Founder Lorraine Hart. I stood in the gravel parking lot, the vibration of the heavy engines humming through the soles of my expensive Italian shoes, and finally understood the magnitude of my mistake. I hadn't just kicked my mother out of an apartment. I had tried to evict the Queen from her own kingdom. The cabin near the Heartline truck yard is small, smelling of pine wood and old coffee grounds. It is a world away from the marble counters and floor-to-ceiling glass of the penthouse, but it fits me better. I sat at the small round table, my hands wrapped around a warm mug, watching through the window as the sun began to bleed over the horizon. One by one, the massive 18-wheelers roared to life, their exhaust plumes rising into the cool morning air before they rolled out of the gate. I watched them leave like a mother watching her children go off to war, knowing some roads are harder than others. On the table, my phone vibrated. It had been vibrating for days. The screen lit up, flashing a notification that made my chest tighten. 97 missed calls. I swiped the screen just enough to see the preview of the text messages. Mum, please pick up. Mum, I am sorry. Mum, they took the car. Mum, Brittany is freaking out. Panic. Pure, unadulterated panic. I read the first few lines, my heart hammering against my ribs, but my face remained stone still. I turned the screen off. I sat there in the silence and thought about Joe. I remembered a winter evening 25 years ago. Eric was 10 years old, and he had come home from school embarrassed because a classmate had seen his father picking him up in the rig. He had thrown his backpack down and shouted, "Why can't you just drive a car like normal dads? You are just a truck driver." It was the only time I ever saw Joe truly angry. He didn't yell. He just took Eric by the collar of his coat and marched him out to the yard. He made him stand in the freezing wind next to the tires that were taller than he was. "You look at this, son," Joe had said, his voice low and dangerous. "You think this rig drives itself. You think the food on your table just appears there. Every mile on this odometer is a piece of my life I gave for you. Don't you ever look down on the work that feeds you?" Eric had cried then, but I wondered now if he had ever really understood. Later that afternoon, Denise knocked on the cabin door. She came in and sat opposite me, looking at the dark circles under my eyes. "Lorraine," she said softly, "you haven't slept. I can't sleep." "Denise?" I admitted, tracing the rim of my mug. I keep asking myself if I am doing the right thing. Am I destroying him, or am I finally doing what I should have done 10 years ago? "He needed a wake-up call," Denise said, reaching across to touch my hand. "I made him this way," I whispered, the guilt finally spilling out. I wanted to protect him from the struggle Joe and I went through. So I built a bubble around him. I let him think the world was soft. I let him think money was just something that happened. I thought I was being a good mother, but I was just crippling him. My laptop pinged with an email from Monica. The subject line read, "Shareholder meeting, Skyline Mobility, Houston HQ, tomorrow, 2:00 p.m. The body of the email was short. "You can send a proxy. Lorraine, you don't have to be in the room when the axe falls. But if you want this to stick, you should be there." I stared at the screen. I pulled out a piece of paper and a pen. I started to write a letter to Eric, explaining everything. telling him I loved him, telling him I would fix it if he just apologized. I wrote 3 paragraphs. Then I looked at the phone again. 97 missed calls. He was calling out of fear for his lifestyle, not out of understanding for his mother. I ripped the letter in half. Then I ripped it again. I am going. I told the empty room. That night, I laid my old grey suit out on the bed. I found a loose seam on the jacket and sat under the yellow lamp, stitching it closed with steady hands. Then I went to the closet and pulled out a pair of men's dress shoes. They were Joe's. I sat on the floor and polished them until the leather shone like obsidian. I would not wear them, but I would carry them in my bag. I needed him in that room with me. Before I turned off the light, I picked up my phone one last time. The number 97 stared back at me. I took a deep breath. I pressed clear all. The notifications vanished. The screen was empty. There would be no more listening to voicemails, no more reading, begging texts. The next words we exchanged would be face to face. I walked out to the truck while the stars were still out. I threw my bag into the passenger seat of the Heartline pickup. The engine turned over with a reliable growl. As I pulled onto the interstate heading south toward Houston, the headlights swept over a green sign that read, "Rest Area, 2 miles." I gripped the steering wheel tighter and drove right past it. There was no place to rest on this road. Not tonight. The glass doors of the conference room in Houston slid open with a soft hiss. Eric walked in first, adjusting his tie with a nervous twitch, followed closely by Brittany. She was wearing oversized sunglasses indoors and clutching a designer bag like a shield. They were expecting a faceless board of directors, perhaps a representative from a venture capital firm ready to negotiate. When Eric looked up and saw me sitting at the head of the long mahogany table, he stopped dead in his tracks. The color drained from his face so fast I thought he might faint. I sat flanked by Monica and 2 grim-faced senior analysts from Heartline Holdings. "Mom," Eric breathed out, the word hanging in the air like a question he was afraid to ask. I did not smile. I did not offer him a seat. I simply clasped my hands on the table. "In this room, I am Mrs. Hart," I said, my voice as cold and smooth as the glass walls surrounding us. "The majority shareholder. Please, sit down." Eric stumbled into the chair at the opposite end of the table, the position of the accused. Brittany sat next to him, taking off her sunglasses to glare at me with a mixture of confusion and fury. "What is going on?" Eric asked, his voice cracking. "Why are you here?" Monica opened the thick binder in front of her. "Mr. Hart. Heartline Holdings owns 62% of the common stock in Skyline Mobility. We hold the controlling interest. We have the authority to appoint or remove officers and to approve all major financial decisions. The other gentlemen here represent the remaining angel investors. We are all waiting to hear why you shouldn't be removed for cause." Eric looked around the room, realizing for the first time that the safety net he thought he had spun himself was actually woven by me. I picked up the financial report. "I have reviewed the expenditures for the last 12 months, I said, opening the folder. "A corporate retreat to Tulum, costing $45,000. A monthly retainer of $8,000 for a PR agency that focuses exclusively on Brittany's personal brand. A lease on a Range Rover that was used primarily for grocery runs and photo shoots. Meanwhile, your net profit has been negative for 3 consecutive quarters." "You don't understand," Eric stammered, leaning forward, sweat beading on his forehead. That is branding. In the tech world, Image is everything. We have to look successful to attract Series B funding. Mr. Henderson, an elderly investor who had been with me since the 90s, let out a dry, humorless chuckle. Son, I invested in Heartline Logistics when your mother was running it out of a kitchen. I never saw her spend a single dime on image. She spent it on tires and fuel. That is why she is rich. And you are broke. Brittany slammed her hand on the table, her bracelets jingling. This is ridiculous. You are just doing this to control him. You are bitter because we asked for some boundaries. You don't understand modern business. Lorraine, influencing is a job. I bring eyes to the product. I didn't look at her. I picked up a remote control and pointed it at the screen behind me. A projection appeared. It was a chain of emails between Brittany and the company accountant. Is this part of the job? I asked. On the screen, highlighted in yellow, was a request from Brittany to categorize a $5,000 invoice for aesthetic dermatology as consulting fees, and another for 2 luxury handbags labeled as client gifts. Next to the email, Monica had placed a screenshot from Brittany's Instagram showing her wearing the bag with the caption, "Treat yourself." The room went dead silent. Brittany's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Eric stared at the screen, his face turning a shade of grey. This is embezzlement, I said flatly. And as CEO, Eric, you signed off on the checks. I didn't look at the codes, Eric whispered, putting his head in his hands. Exactly, I said. You never look. I closed the folder. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Effective immediately. You are removed as CEO of Skyline Mobility, I announced. We are bringing in an interim director from Heartline to restructure the debt. If you wish to remain with the company, you may do so. We are offering you the position of Director of Operations. Director of Operations, Eric repeated, looking sick. Your salary will be $60,000 a year. I continued. No corporate card, no expense account. You will report to the new director, and you will work out of the general office pool. You can't accept that. Eric Brittany shrieked, grabbing his arm. Stand up for yourself. Stand up for us. She is trying to humiliate you. Eric looked at her. Then he looked at the screen with the emails. And finally, he looked at me. His eyes were wet. He opened his mouth to argue, to defend his dignity. But the weight of the numbers crushed him. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that he wasn't a tycoon. He was a fraud. Eric started, but his voice failed. He slumped in his chair. I stood up, signaling the meeting was over. I looked down the long table at my son, the boy I had loved enough to ruin, and now loved enough to break. You said something to me on your birthday, I said softly, ensuring every word landed. You said, if you want to live in this house, you have to pay rent. Well, Eric, if you want to stay in this company, you have to work like any other employee. Meeting adjourned. The fallout was immediate, and I watched it happen from the silence of my cabin, like a general observing a distant battlefield through a pair of binoculars. Brittany was the first casualty. I heard from the building manager that she did not even spend the night after the meeting. She packed her bags and left a note on the kitchen island that was as cold as the marble itself. She wrote that she would not sign divorce papers yet, but she refused to live in poverty. She told Eric that unless he could repair his image, she was gone. My son, the man who had mocked me for living on a budget, was forced to vacate the penthouse 3 days later. He could not afford the new lease I had drafted, and he certainly could not pass the credit check. He moved into a third-floor walk-up in a working-class neighborhood on the edge of town. There were no movers in uniformed shirts to pack his boxes this time. I imagined him sweating in the Texas heat, hauling crates up the narrow stairs one by one, his Italian loafers scuffing against the concrete. At Skyline Mobility, the demotion was absolute. Eric was stripped of his corner office with the view of the city. The interim CEO, a sharp-eyed woman I had sent from Heartline, moved his desk to the open-plan area right next to the noisy photocopy machine. He was no longer the visionary founder. He was the director of operations, a title that sounded important, but meant he was the one who had to fix the messes he used to ignore. I tracked his progress through the weekly reports Denise sent me. For the first time in his life, Eric was forced to leave the air conditioning. He was down in the loading docks, inspecting cargo, listening to drivers complain about the glitchy app he had spent millions marketing but pennies developing. He is learning. Lorraine. Denise told me over the phone one evening. He spent an hour today listening to a young mother explain why a late delivery of formula cost her a day of work. He looked ashamed. He was learning the math of survival. He learned that a missed delivery window wasn't just a data point, it was a driver losing their safety bonus. He learned that fuel costs weren't abstract numbers. They were the difference between profit and loss. One night, around 10 o'clock, Denise sent me a grainy photo she had taken from the doorway of the warehouse. It showed Eric sitting on a wooden shipping crate, eating a cheap sandwich from the vending machine. His tie was loosened, his sleeves rolled up, and his face was smeared with dust. He looked exhausted. I stared at the photo, thinking about the $80 steaks he used to buy for dinner without blinking. Now, he was tasting the difference between money that is given and money that is earned. My phone continued to log his attempts to reach me. He called late at night, probably when the silence of his small apartment became too much to bear. I watched the screen light up with his name, Eric, and then fade to black. No answer. It was a sentence I had to let him serve. Denise told me about the confrontation in the yard. She had found him struggling to unhitch a trailer, his hands raw and blistering because he was trying to do it with his bare skin. He wasn't complaining, but he was struggling. She had walked up to him, not as an employee speaking to a boss, but as a veteran speaking to a rookie. She pulled a pair of heavy-duty work gloves from her back pocket and tossed them at his chest. "Put them on," she had said, her voice dry. "The family of the old boss does not get to whine about blisters in this yard." Eric had looked at her, stunned, and silently pulled the gloves on. He didn't fire her. He didn't yell. He just nodded and went back to work. Months bled into one another. The reports started to change. The red ink on the Skyline balance sheets began to turn black. The app was updated, not with flashy features, but with practical tools the drivers had asked for. Eric lost weight. The bloat of expensive whiskey and rich food disappeared, replaced by the lean look of a man who was on his feet for 12 hours a day. He was tanned, tired, and had dark circles under his eyes, but the arrogance was gone. He was no longer playing at business from a rooftop bar. He was building it from the ground up, one crate at a time. And I sat in my cabin, drinking my coffee, waiting for the moment when the transformation would be complete. It was a heavy Texas storm, the kind that drowns out everything else. Eric sat in the temporary office next to the truck yard, listening to the rain hammer against the corrugated tin roof like 1,000 drum beats. It had been a long day of troubleshooting a system crash and running an emergency delivery himself. But for the first time in his life, his exhaustion felt clean. He looked down at the handwritten expense ledger on his desk. He ran his finger down the column of numbers. In just a few months of honest, sweating labor, he had paid off every cent of his personal credit card debt. He pulled his phone from his pocket. He stared at my contact name. He told himself that if I did not answer this time, he would stop. He would accept his exile. He pressed the call button. He listened to the ringback tone. Once, twice, 3 times. Then, there was a click. Hello? My voice was raspy, worn down by the same silence that had haunted him. The line went quiet for a long, heavy moment. Mom, Eric choked out, his voice cracking. Mom, I am sorry. I was so stupid. I left you standing there at that party like a stranger. It was the first time he had called me Mom in months. I sat at my kitchen table, gripping the phone tight enough to turn my knuckles white. I did not cry. I could not afford to cry yet. Tell me what you said. Eric. I commanded, my voice trembling just slightly. Tell me exactly what you said to me that night. I said. Eric hesitated, his breath hitching. I said that you were a burden on my budget. I said you had to pay or leave. And now I asked, if I need a place to stay tonight, do you tell me to pay? Or do you tell me to come home? I would pay your rent for you, Eric said, his voice steadying into a profound seriousness. Because that is what a decent man does. But I would never call a place home again if it didn't have a room for you. I don't care about the penthouse. Mom, I just want my mother back. I closed my eyes, letting out a breath I felt like I had been holding for half a year. I am not giving you the penthouse back, I said firmly, and I am not handing over the controlling shares. Skyline Mobility remains under Heartline Holdings. You keep your job as Director of Operations only if you continue to file reports like every other employee. No exceptions. I understand, he said immediately. However, I added, looking out the window at the dark yard, if you can keep Skyline profitable for 12 months using this new model you are building, then I will transfer a portion of the stock to your name. Not as an inheritance, Eric, but as a bonus. For work rendered. Eric drove to my cabin before the sun was fully up. The rain had slowed to a drizzle. The truck yard was quiet. He walked up the wooden steps and found me sitting on the porch with 2 mugs of black coffee. He looked thinner, older, but his eyes were clear. We did not hug. There were no melodramatic tears. I simply nodded at him, and he sat down beside me. I had to do it, I said, looking at the steam rising from my cup. I hit you where it hurt most, because I had to break that ego before it hardened. If I hadn't, you would have dragged this whole company down with you eventually. I know, Eric said quietly. You saved me from myself. We sat there as the sun began to breach the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges. The light hit the wet metal of the trucks parked in the yard, illuminating the Heartline Logistics logo on the doors. From now on, I said, pointing at the fleet, what you have will be what you build with your own 2 hands, not what you get from my silence. That is the only way I can love you and still sleep at night. Eric nodded, taking a sip of the coffee. He looked at me, really looked at me, and smiled a tired, genuine smile. Thanks. Mom, he said, for the job. The revenge was over. The lesson was learned. And as the engines began to turn over in the yard, rumbling to life for another day of work, I knew that my son was finally ready to drive his own road. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to hear where you are tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and share your thoughts on Eric's journey. Don't forget to subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary, hit that like button, and smash the hype button to help this story reach even more people.